welcome everyone to this online lecture called Activism of the Soul in Times of Crisis. First of all, I would like to thank Taste-Free Waste for asking me to facilitate this lecture about topics that caught my attention already a couple of years ago. For those who don't know me, I'm Lara and I'm the former coordinator of Taste-Free Waste, and I've also been a food waste activist throughout the last years. And on this photo, you see me doing my first volunteer shift at a giveaway market. After we collected food that couldn't be sold anymore, tried to give it to people and also engage them in a conversation about our food system and tell them what they can do to reduce their personal food waste. I was immediately inspired by the mission of Taste-Free Waste to empower citizens to take food into their own hands, but also to create a community of shared knowledge around it. And after being an engaged volunteer, I took over the coordination and also the coordination at the beginning of 2019 and led the initiative throughout the year. I decided to continue my journey with the Root of Life project that I initiated recently, and through which I intend to create a space of sharing and learning, and I will also facilitate workshops to support the inner change that we need to step into in order to support outer change towards a more life-sustaining society. And this lecture and also the Root of Life in general is inspired by my work as a food waste activist, but also my psychology studies, my work with deep ecology that really truly made me find understanding for a lot of thoughts that I carried with me for quite some time, especially Joanna Macy, but also Charles Eisenstein back then, but also my work as a mindfulness trainer. And this lecture today is also greatly inspired by Macy's work on active hope and the work that reconnects. So what are we going to talk about today? Today I will talk about grief, anxiety, and feelings of uncertainty in times of crisis, mostly the climate crisis, but since the corona crisis, in my perspective, is originating from the same problem, a lot of things are relevant for both. We're also going to talk about how we tend to cope and suppress those emotions on an individual and collective level, and where this leads us to, and how we can cope more effectively and mindfully so we can grow both inner and outer resilience towards a more life-sustaining society without getting stuck in despair. And there will be also some short exercises that I likewise also take home practices. So we will start with the spiral of the work that reconnects by Macy. I want to take this moment to do a little gratitude exercise with you. So I want to ask you to take a pen and paper, and I will read out 2 questions, and after each question I want you to think about them and write down your answer. So the first question is, some things I love being alive on Earth are? And try to finish your sentence. And the second question is, a person who helped me believe in myself is or was? And also try to finish this question. So, why are we doing this, you may ask yourself? Gratitude is very powerful because it can be practiced anywhere at any time. And it's a very good starting point, especially when you're dealing with grief, anxiety, and feelings of uncertainty. It works as some kind of emotional buffer. And it also brings you liberation from this industrial growth society that we're living in, because it contradicts this message of, in order to live a fulfilling life, we need to consume more. And gratitude makes you realize that actually you don't need all this stuff. Most what makes you happy in life you already have. I want to share a little bit about this photo. I took this at an action, I think 3 years ago, from Ende Gelände in Germany. And on the left side you see a beautiful forest that is left, and on the right side you see a huge coal mine. This photo really kind of reminds myself that we still have a choice, so that we can still choose to change our behaviors and to create awareness about destruction that is happening. But if we don't do that, and if we don't take this action, we're gonna end up destroying all our ecosystems. So, left or right? I would go for left. And I want you now to take again your pen and paper. We're gonna do a Paint for the World exercise. And this time I want you to write down immediately what comes up in your mind without thinking too much about it. So the first question is, when I imagine the world we leave to the next generations and our children, it looks like... And try to also finish this answer. And the second question is, one of my fear related to the corona pandemic is... And we move on to the last question, which is, ways I avoid these feelings include... And also try to finish your answer. And maybe you're familiar with this exercise and with the thoughts that came up, maybe not. What is important here is that by bringing those fears and thoughts in the open, we take away their power to haunt us. And I want to share a bit about how I feel in those days of Corona. I have very mixed feelings of all kinds. At this time, I feel very grateful for being able to record this and share my knowledge with you. But also while I'm saying this, I feel very privileged to be able to sit here and to not have to worry about having food or having a place to stay. So there's also guilt, but also grief about how hard the vulnerable population is hit by this crisis, and also crisis in general. And that vulnerable populations like refugees, immigrants, but also indigenous communities are often the one that contribute the least to this development of the crisis. So this brings up a lot of also frustration in a way. And if this goes together with feeling of anxiety, I can also feel despair. So if we apply this grief and feeling of guilt and anxiety to the state of the world and look at the major problems we are facing today, like biodiversity loss, climate change, overexploitation of natural resources, health threats, environmental degradation, but also all potential uncontrollable risks that we don't even know about. But also if you look at our food system and realize that there are still 840 million people who are suffering from chronic hunger, while in the Western world we throw away 40% of all the food that is produced for human consumption, often produced in those countries where people suffer from hunger. Then we wrap it in plastic and ship it all the way to the Western world, where almost half of it ends up in the trash. And I think that's ridiculous, even though I said that already so many times, it still shocks me. So this all creates a planetary emergency of overwhelming proportions. And watching the impact of climate change unfold and also worrying about the future generations and children may be a source of stress. And this is also termed eco-anxiety. And research shows that some people are deeply affected by feelings of loss, helplessness, but also frustration due to their inability to feel like they're making any difference in climate change. And also guilt is a very widespread feeling as people contemplate the impact of their own behavior on future generations. And individuals can experience a feeling of loss of autonomy, loss of control, which in turn also has an impact on their mental health. In some cases, information that increases this perception of the reality of climate change can feel so overwhelming that people rather deny it and don't support action because they cannot look at it. It's too painful to really realize the problems we are facing. And maybe you're already familiar with the responses that came up in this exercise. And if you feel like sharing anything, please feel free to write a comment in the section below. I will get back to that. So, pain for the world, including rage, grief, despair, anxiety, is a very normal and healthy response to a world in crisis. And I think that's very important to underline here. And if we zoom out and look at how and whether we respond to those emotions in society, we see that whether and how we respond is based on whether the situation is seen as valuable by our culture. And I think that's important to underline here. And we have been conditioned to avoid discomfort at all costs because we're often too afraid to be stuck in despair or fall in depression, etc. And we do all kinds of effort to not sitting with this feeling of lack of control and groundlessness. And what I learned through my studies is that this avoidance easily becomes a habit within yourself, but also in society. And we search for ways to cope with this stress. And often that's avoidance mechanisms like shopping or Netflixing. And the corona pandemic and the ecological crisis can leave us with a lot of fear and uncertainty about the future. And they're especially now very present, especially if you are very aware of the problems we are facing in combination with the corona crisis can be very overwhelming because it's difficult at this time to do actions. And often there's little space for sharing those feelings, especially in public, and it's often considered as something weak and it's labeled as oversensitive. And for me personally, it's not too long ago that I would suppress those emotions and most importantly not share them with others because I felt like that there was no space for it. And I thought that this was some kind of symptom of an underlying problem that I had. And I noticed that also my friends didn't do that. For me this kind of seemed weird because I know that of course this is a universal feeling. So I decided to create space for sharing those emotions with my friends. So I organized like sharing circles where we kind of talked about those emotions and where we created a bit more space for it. And this is also where the root of life took roots. So to bring this back to our way of coping with emotions like grief, anxiety and despair, here's also an invitation to be curious and look at how you're responding to those emotions and whether you find any avoidance mechanisms. And why would you do that, you may ask yourself. So the consequence of suppressing negative emotions is that we feel less alive, we feel less energy, and our sensitivity is also turning deaf. And studies from Patel and Gross show that suppressing emotions can decrease your health and well-being, both physically and psychologically. And even though emotional suppressing might reduce the external expression, it never reduces the inner emotional experience. And this suppression gets held in our body and creates a host of downstream effects, like for example anxiety, depression, but also stress-related illness, and can go all the way to substance abuse and even suicide in extreme forms. And we suffer often in silence, which can create also loneliness and the feeling that one is having symptoms to be treated of an underlying problem. So I think we need to understand that we are shaped socially and that sometimes the option of how to respond that are supported by society are pulling us down. And this often results in feeling of powerlessness and insignificance in one's own ability to create change. And maybe you're familiar with that as well. So what happens if we do share? If people share, research shows that a weight is lifted from their shoulders and something foundational happens. They gain a new appetite to act, but also a new appetite for life in general. And I want to share with you some mindful coping mechanisms that I think are very useful and that also research shows are very effective. And those are strengthening personal resilience, supporting connectedness and cultivate mindful coping, foster active hope, and community engagement. So we start with personal resilience. I'm going to read out a definition of resilience. Resilience can be defined as the ability of a person or a community to cope with, grow through, and transcend adversity. And it's also called self-efficacy. So on an individual level, resilience is built internally through strategies such as coping and self-regulation, but also in community and social support networks. And earlier we did this gratitude exercise, which also can help us to strengthen our personal resilience. And especially when you're dealing with grief, anxiety, and uncertainty, gratitude can give you this emotional buffer I was talking about earlier, because we tend to get stuck in those negative thoughts and we tend to forget, all the parts that make life beautiful. So whenever you feel like you're stuck, you can just ask yourself what you're grateful for. And this is shown to be really effective in reducing anxiety, but also feelings of stress and coming out of your negative thoughts. And gratitude also helps you to realize that this negative thoughts that you are in is not always representative for how it really is in that moment. And what is also very powerful about gratitude is that you can express it towards people, but also towards the earth, the air, water, but also strangers. And it shows to feed level of trust. And trust is something that is declining in our society. And it motivates us to act for the world because we learn to appreciate the living beings and we feel the need for protecting them. We start realizing that our well-being is so much depending on the well-being of others in our ecosystems. Another very good tool is journaling, because it's important that we bring those feelings and thoughts that we have in the open. And if writing doesn't work for you, then maybe movement or drawing, whatever works for you. It's just about creating space for those thoughts. And what helped me a lot is also mindfulness, because I learned to actively cope and self-regulate my emotions and thoughts, and also I gained more sense of meaning. So by understanding emotions as intimately connected to our thinking, and not just as human flaws that need to be suppressed, we learn to not only welcome positive emotions, but also negative emotions. We learn to attend to our thoughts and feelings, which also can help us to gain more understanding for how the mind works. And also we gain more autonomy to participate actively in building our lives based on our intentions. And what we attend to also becomes our lives and our decisions and our behaviors. And mindfulness works in two main ways. By increasing awareness of feelings in the body and regulating emotion, you can be more aware of feelings that come in response to a sense of threat, and accept that these feelings are there in this moment. And then before you react, what we tend to do always, take a break and breathe and kind of observe what is happening. When you practice this a couple of times, you will notice that you have this autonomy of deciding how you want to react to this emotion. And this starts with being aware of how you would usually react, and also asking yourself whether how you would usually react, whether this motivates you to act or whether this pulls you down and makes you just feel smaller. So it's really about this recasting of this narrative from looking at the outcome, for example, with climate change, will we destroy our world, to the process of where are we now and what can we do in this moment. And in the corona pandemic, for example, mindfulness can also help us to react mindfully and to decide to isolate yourself because you don't want to put too much pressure on our health system. Also within the climate crisis, it helps us to face uncomfortable truth and to understand how a sense of self is so much shaped of the experience in society, and how our social programming is fostering behavior that is causing horrifying levels of human suffering and destroying the biosphere. And it helped me also a lot because I become much more aware of these mindless, self-serving motivations that are very harmful for our collective immune system, but also our ecosystem. And I think in order to make a shift to a life-sustaining society, we really need to go to those roots of motivational cognition, even to how do we see ourselves in relation to other living beings. Also to ask ourselves whether the way we do it is a way that we want to support. And mindfulness is not just about individuals who can understand and regulate themselves, but it's also about improving groups and organizations and see how systems can work more effectively in the climate crisis. And we attend and think together, not alone. So we are influenced by our relationships, our environment, and our internal states. So we need to also be aware of those. And so-called social mindfulness can also help us to uncover and reflect on how the past has conditioned our implicit beliefs and opinions, but also values and personal experiences, including traumas. And through that, we can also trace stressful individualist, competitive, materialist thoughts, attitudes, and experiences to their socially conditioned origins. And we can witness, hold and let go of these things as one way to heal and transform ourselves, but also our relationships and our institutions. And another thing that works very good to strengthen resilience is nature practices. And that's also what research shows. So spending time in nature, but also gardening, helps you to release your stress. And this is also something that is supported throughout socioeconomic status, age, and gender. And a second coping mechanism is support connectedness and cultivate mindful coping. So we look more on community level. And in system theory, negative feedback loops show us how the ability to suffer with our world is very essential for our survival. So feeling grief if parts of our world were dying is a normal and a healthy response to a world in trauma. And it's essential to pay attention to those feedback loops that tell us when we are off course, so we can respond with a course direction. And we're not just unblocking negative feedback, but also creating channels of felt connectedness that join us with our world. And these channels can act like a root system that opening us to a broader source of strength when we realize that our concerns that we share about the state of the world, we do share with so many others. And also connectedness to others, family, friends, community is a psychological need and also helps us to push our well-being. And being aware of your own thoughts and attitudes can also help you to better understand others and feel more compassion and support each other in this process that we need to go through. And we shouldn't forget the power of conversation, because by bringing things in the open, feelings that you have, you not only make them visible to yourself but also to others. And the more we drop things in the open, the more we become also inclined to tackle them collectively. And it's often also because of our struggles, not despite them, that we feel this sense of common humanity. For example, if you look at the corona pandemic, we are all facing, or millions of people are facing, a similar threat at this moment, even though we are different situations. But a lot of people feel at this moment loneliness, and they feel grief because they lost a close one. And this can also help us to strengthen this communal resilience. And here I think it's also important to mention that worldviews and ideologies can act as a filter, and they help us to decrease or increase concerns about climate change or about the corona crisis, but also towards motivation of acting, towards finding solutions. So we do not perceive the world neutrally. Instead, we perceive it through motivated cognition, and we strive to maintain a worldview that is supported by our social groups. And I think it's important to realize that those agreements we made as social groups on how to react to certain things were once built between individuals. And I think we shouldn't forget to think that this is a reality. We should always question whether those are helping us towards a life-sustaining society or whether they are destroying our community and also our ecosystems. And I think it's good to also put practices to all those knowledge. So a way to honor this pain for the world and also create space for it is to look for example, objects in your surroundings that represent this loss that you are experiencing. Whenever there's a species that we're losing or ecosystems or a close one, you can use this object and put it somewhere and it will remind you of this loss. And the reason why this is very helpful is that this loss of ecosystems and species and people is not acknowledged enough. Because if we would acknowledge, we wouldn't continue business as usual like we're doing now. By choosing also to honor this pain rather than discounting it, we also break the silence of status quo, and we collectively grieve and care that we lost something that is very valuable to us, which can also function as motivation to do more to protect future loss. And the third coping mechanism I want to talk about is foster active hope. And this is based on Macy's work, and I want to read out a quote from her I really like. "The most radical thing any of us can do at this time is to be fully present to what is happening in the world." And I already said that earlier, that it's important to be with the emotion that we are feeling and create more space with it. And what Macy is also saying is that it's important also to reframe and find something positive in those circumstances when you're feeling a lot of negative thoughts. And positively reappraising our circumstances can also help us to move forward rather than being stuck in negative emotions. So there are 3 steps I just want to briefly talk about. So active hope is a lot about showing up in this moment, informing yourself about problems that we are facing, and accepting that they are there and that also the emotions that come with it are there. Because in order to get where we want to get, we need to start from where we are in this moment with all the emotions that we are facing. And the second step is that we turn away from behaviors and also ways of being that are toxic to the well-being of the earth. So I already talked about this. It's important that we look at habits, behaviors, and ways of thinking that are not helping us right now. And that can be mindless and self-serving motivations I was talking about earlier, but also the suppression of emotions and feelings. And from there, it's important that we think about what do we hope for and what is our intention in life. So from there, we turn towards expression of a life-sustaining civilization. And with this, it's important to look at how do I make my intention more likely to happen? What helps me to connect to my compassion and my intention, and also what gives me support in this process? And what is my role in this life-sustaining society? And active hope really helps us to not turn our backs towards each other when everything is falling apart in the crisis. So standing in solidarity and moving together is very essential here. And I remember that there was a certain time when I was a food waste activist where I was confronted by all the problems that we are facing, which was very overwhelming sometimes, and I felt this losing of control over situations, and I made very negative predictions about the future, which felt very unpleasant, of course. And I started realizing that this feeling of control that I so greatly needed, and that people in general love having control, is just an illusion. We never fully have the control over the situation. And also anxiety often arises from this lack of control, of thinking that you don't have control over something. So I kind of became aware of that, and also through that kind of let go a little bit of it. And now I know that whenever I feel anxiety and losing control, I can ask myself whether I can predict the future and whether those thoughts are motivating us to make a difference or whether they're just pulling me down and letting me feel very insignificant. But also whether those thoughts belong to a life-sustaining society or whether they belong to a capitalist society that perceives you as a consumer and makes you feel very insignificant. And the last coping mechanism I'm going to talk about with you is community engagement. Because I think it's so important that, especially now that we are receiving so much negative news about the pandemic, but there's little space for empowering of how we can be engaged in making a difference, but also how we can do local actions. And learning and experiencing the local effects of climate change make the problem more tangible. And also through connecting climate impacts to practical solutions, we encourage action, but we also push our emotional resilience. And when community members are involved, research shows that there's a greater sense of autonomy and ownership, and that also likely increases the sense of efficacy. It's important that we utilize local skills and also maintain cultural practices, like growing food, for example, but also expand the reach of efforts to help those suffering. And a well-known finding in psychology is also that helping others also increases your own well-being. And this is an overview of all the literature that I used. So we came to an end of this lecture. If you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to write them in the comment section, and I will get back to that. If you feel like interested in diving deeper in one of those topics, but also in empowerment work, the inner transition that we need to step into for a life-sustaining society, mindfulness, then please check out my Facebook and my Instagram. I'm also busy with making a website currently. Soon I will be also giving workshops. Feel free to check that out, and thank you so much for listening, and I hope you also learned something, and I wish you a beautiful evening.